If we were to assume that the Gospel of Mark was written in the year 25 CE, for example, and we also assume that what was written in the Gospel concerning Jesus' miracles and death is true, and we assume that he did them roughly in the years from 30 to 33 CE, we would have to grant that Mark himself was truly prophetic, for there would be no other explanation for how someone could have written about Jesus' miracles and death before they occurred. Lots of assumptions can be flying around at this point. But since no Christians that I know of claims that Mark wrote his gospel prior to Jesus' death and resurrection, then we can also agree with them that Mark was not prophetic and that he wrote his gospel after those events had transpired, if they actually happened. This would then give us a lower limit of roughly 33 CE. Of course, this date assumes that Jesus actually lived and was killed roughly around 33 CE. So, although the concept of Mark writing after the events is sound, we have based our lower limit on a date that is by no means sound. In other words, the date of Jesus' alleged death. With conflicting birth dates in Matthew and Luke, and debate about whether Jesus even existed, we must find an event referenced in Mark that we can date accurately in order to be confident about our lower limit. So our lower limit of 33 CE doesn't inspire much confidence in me at this point. It can be tricky to try and use the Bible to verify the Bible. Fortunately for us, the Gospel of Mark contains a reference to a historical event for which we know the exact dates. The entire 13th chapter of Mark concerns the end of time and Jesus' return to earth. This chapter speaks of horrible suffering and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. It then describes cosmic portents that precede the appearance of Jesus at the end of time. But did Mark understand these to be tribulations thousands of years into the future? In 66 CE, with Nero as emperor of Rome, a Jewish revolt against Rome broke out due to religious tensions between Greeks and Jews and culminated in the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 CE under the Roman Emperor Vespasian and his son Titus, who was in charge of the military campaign. To say that the sacking of Jerusalem was catastrophic is almost an understatement. It was seen by Jews and even Christians as the worst thing that had ever happened to them since history began. For in those days there will be tribulation such as has not been seen since the beginning of creation, which God created until this time, nor ever shall be. To the Jews, such a thing simply could not happen. How could God destroy his own temple or allow it to be destroyed by the heathens? If God was for them, how could such a thing occur? The temple was razed to the ground and most of the city burned and ransacked. The siege lasted for years. Many who tried to flee were caught and crucified just outside the city. Many starved to death inside the city due to sabotage of the dry food stores by the Sicarii, which may be where the name Judas Iscariot came from, the ultimate Jewish betrayer, Judas, Judah, Judea, and possibly a symbol that stood for all Jews in the eyes of the author of the Gospel of Mark, who was clearly anti-Semitic, a non-Jewish Christian writing from the relative safety of Rome, so many scholars believe. To this Gentile Christian, the Jews had rejected the gospel message wholesale, and that meant that they had rejected God's Son and salvation. And God didn't appreciate that too much, and so he destroyed them completely. An interesting side note, the Jews did not later ascribe the destruction of Jerusalem to the crucifixion of anyone named Jesus. They blamed it on the death of James the Just, which supports the idea that there never was a Jesus on the landscape to begin with. But now back to the task at hand. Let's take a look at Mark's depiction of the destruction of Jerusalem. And Jesus answered and said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." Luke verifies that Mark is indeed referencing the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 CE. "And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out. and let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto. The Roman legions surrounded the city of Jerusalem and originally intended to simply wait and force them into surrender due to lack of food and water, but the Jews wouldn't surrender under any circumstances, and they sent their own parties out to secretly attack the Romans. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. The embellished version found in Luke helps us to see that the tribulations mentioned and the destruction of the temple match up with what we know about the Jewish-Roman War of 66 to 73 CE. The reference to fleeing to the mountains might be a dual reference to both the random escape into hiding by those outside the city walls and the now famous Masada, where almost 1,000 Jews of the Sicarii clan committed suicide rather than be captured by the Romans. A few of them did not commit suicide and were indeed captured and recounted their version of the events, which made it into Josephus's War of the Jews. Perhaps another reference to the siege by Titus can be found fairly hidden to modern thinking in the story of the demon-possessed man who lived in a cave at Gadarenas. The story is a memorable one. The demons infesting the man referred to themselves as Legion and also claimed that there were many of them. Around 2,000, in fact, if we assume one demon per pig. And he asked him, "What is thy name?" And he answered, saying, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And forthwith Jesus gave them leave, and the unclean spirits went out and entered into the swine, and the herd ran violently down a steep place into the sea. They were about 2,000, and were choked in the sea. This may be a reference to the Roman legions that Titus brought from Egypt, as can be seen in this snip of text from Book 5 of Josephus's War of the Jews. Those also that had been selected out of these 4 legions and sent with Mucianus to Italy had their places filled up out of these soldiers that came out of Egypt with Titus, who were 2,000 men, chosen out of the armies of Alexandria. Another reference to the final decimation of Jerusalem is the interesting reference to the abomination of desolation, as mentioned in Mark, Daniel, and 1 Maccabees. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Sometime around the year 167 BCE, Antiochus IV Epiphanes set up an altar to Zeus in the Second Temple in Jerusalem, and upon it he sacrificed, of all things, swine. This would have been quite the insult to any good beard-wearing Jew, and it is likely the source of both the Maccabees and Daniel references, with the former being a mere history of the events, and the latter pretending to be a prophecy of the events several hundred years earlier. Now the 15th day of the month, Caslu, in the 145th year, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar, and builded idol altars throughout the cities of Judah on every side, and burnt incense at the doors of their houses and in the streets. We know this refers to Antiochus IV because, among other things, we are told explicitly just a few paragraphs earlier in verse 41 of this same chapter. Moreover, King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and everyone should leave his laws, so all the heathen agreed according to the commandment of the king. Yea, many also of the Israelites consented to his religion, and sacrificed unto idols, and profaned the Sabbath. Again, a writer can only know precise details of an event or that a catastrophic event took place if he's writing after the events have taken place. Therefore, we can know with certainty